What's up everyone, this is Konicus here, and welcome to my first ever PvP guide in SWTOR, which is going to be on the Fury Marauder patch 5.4a. Now today we're going to be discussing the more intermediate to advanced level aspects of this particular skill tree slash spec, and not the beginner's aspect. So if you need something more akin to beginner's advice, I'd suggest going somewhere on the forums or somewhere else like that. People there might be able to help you. But for those of you who either have just started playing the Fury spec, or who want to better themselves in the spec after playing it for a while, then I do believe that this guide is for you. So without further ado, this is my PvP guide on Fury Marauder patch 5.4a. Okay, so when it comes to gearing your Fury Marauder, there are two key stats you want to keep in mind the most out of all your stats, and those are crit and power. Now, the max critical rating is 1,800 in terms of rating, and I'm currently sitting at about 2,100. Now, the max cap would give you roughly 40% crit chance, and I'm currently sitting at about 45% crit chance because I tend to find that it just gives me a greater gain in DPS overall, personally, and that's just what I like to use. And for power, I have 5,000 for my rating, and for my damage, that's about 4,500 max right there. Now, I like to use a lot more power as opposed to mastery, because since I already have a high critical multiplier, and since mastery gives a slight boost to critical multiplier, I feel like I don't need that boost to critical multiplier, since the critical stat itself is already doing a good enough job. As you can tell, it's 83% multiplier. I think that's pretty good, and it's definitely done well for me in the past and continues to do so. Now, when it comes to alacrity, I'm currently running about 8% alacrity, which is about 800. The rating is about 800. And this is what I use for my crit build. I use 8% alacrity, and I use 45% crit chance, and I also use anything above 80% crit multiplier. The numbers tend to vary, but currently it's sitting at about 83%. Now, for my alacrity build, I go up to 12% alacrity, and I just sacrifice a little bit of crit for that, which gets me to about an 80% multiplier and a 40-41% crit chance. So those would be your main stats and what you want to pay attention to. Now, accuracy, I would definitely discard entirely, since it's not a PvP stat and it's basically useless, in my opinion. And most people will tell you the same, that it's useless in PvP. It is primarily a PvE stat and is to be avoided at all costs if you can. So that would be how you would gear your Marauder, and this is just my personal recommendation. You can gear however you want personally. You can throw in as much of whatever you want in there, but this is just my preference and what I use. Okay, so when it comes to your utilities as a Fury Marauder, you want to maximize your DPS. Since you are a DPS class, that's what you're supposed to do. And my particular set of utilities, at least in my opinion anyway, is geared towards, and geared very nicely towards doing DPS and maximizing your DPS. Now, if you pull up the combat proficiency list here, you'll see all the utility points that I have used here. Now, I'm not going to go through each one in detail, since most other Marauder guides go in great detail for these things, and as I've established from the beginning, this will not be a beginner's based guide, so I will not read through every single one. I will only read through the ones and discuss the ones that I am currently using or would otherwise like to use or have used. Now, my first point I use always goes towards Cloak of Carnage, which increases the damage dealt by Cloak of Pain by 15% and increases its duration by 4 seconds. Now, I personally love this, and most Marauders use this, and it's really a no-brainer. I love it because, yeah, you get a 15% increase in damage dealt by Cloak of Pain, since it does damage to attackers, but what you really want here is a duration increase, because every time you take damage, it resets, and instead of it being a 10-second duration, it would be a 4-second duration, making it 14 seconds, which is way better than 10 and just keeps you alive longer, and every bit of damage mitigation counts when you're a Marauder, since you want to stay alive for as long as possible and deal as much damage as possible, and this will definitely help you do that. Now, my second point I currently have is Brazen, which increases your damage reduction by 2%, and you build 2 Fury when attacked. This Fury effect, of course, cannot occur more than once every 1.5 seconds, once every global cooldown, basically. And I mainly use this for a little bit more survivability, so this can help me, deal more damage. Now, the longer you survive, of course, the more damage you deal. and that slight damage reduction will help, but the real reason to take this is for building 2 Fury when you're attacked. Since as a Marauder you're going to be in the thick of it all the time, and you want that Fury, so you can pop your Berserk more often and keep your Rage going and just keep your DPS going. So at the end of the day, you really can't go wrong with Brazen. But I sometimes do use Cloak of Rage once in a while. While Cloak of Pain is active, it generates 1 Rage whenever you're attacked. This effect can occur more than once every 2 seconds. Now, I use Cloak of Rage sometimes because, you know, you might be in a pinch with Rage as someone who's not particularly experienced with Fury, or someone who has played it for a while but still can't get their Rage management down. This would definitely help you. I know I used this early on in the in this particular patch a few times, because I took a break from Fury for a while and I needed some help getting back into it and getting Rage, and this definitely did the trick. And that's also nice, since on top of Berserk you have that nice extra Rage when you're attacked, because again, you're in the thick of it, and this would definitely help. But I would probably recommend Brazen over it, since I'd rather have that damage reduction and build Fury as opposed to building Rage. Now for my next pair of utilities here, I use Phantom, which increases your movement speed by 15% overall, and the movement speed bonus of Force Camouflage by 20%. Additionally, increases the duration of Force Camo by 2 seconds. Now, a lot of Marauders will have you use Defensive Roll, which reduces damage taken from area effects by 30% and increases internal elemental damage reduction by 3%. Now, they'll have you use this, since again, you will be in the thick of it, and this will definitely help against classes like Sorks, who definitely want to throw that elemental and internal damage at you, and this would help, you know, reduce damage from them. And the area effect seems like a no-brainer, since you'll be in the thick of it and a lot of AoE might come at you, which is generally a smart decision, but I'd rather have Phantom, since I wouldn't want to get involved in those situations. I would just rather get out of the AoE storm and have that boost on Force Camo for escapes, because again, the longer you're alive, the longer you can be around and do more DPS, and I think Phantom does a much better job as opposed to Defensive Roll, but sometimes I do take Defensive Roll. I know in Ranked, I sometimes take it over Phantom, but generally speaking for Regs, you want to go with Phantom in my opinion. It's just what I use, but I think it's a much better alternative as opposed to just staying in there and taking all the damage. Better to just get out to begin with. Now my second utility in this pair is Relentless, and it enables Predation to no longer require or consume Fury, but it will go on a cooldown for 30 seconds when activated. Now, Predation would normally be triggered by use of your 30 stacks of Fury, and this Fury here would go towards that. Now, I'd rather put that towards Berserk, since Berserk is going to keep you and keep your damage going. You know, it's going to keep your damage going a lot longer. And this way you have Relentless as a nice backup defensive. You know, you get a 10% defense chance boost from it, and you get a 50% movement speed boost by default, which is nice because it helps out your group. They get that boost as well, and it helps you out since you can be even more mobile as an already mobile DPS class. Now, in conjunction with that are my next two utility points that I took here. Now, Unbound, my first one in this section here. When Predation is applied or refreshed, it purges movement and pairing effects, and additionally the movement speed of Predation is increased by 30%. So that is up from 50 to 80%, which is a huge boost, and I always love having that boost because, again, I'm an already mobile DPS class as a Marauder. Why not more mobility, right? It's what you want to use. So you get 80%, and not to mention, you get temporary root immunity when you use that one time. You can escape roots with that, and it's very useful because I've had situations where I need to get out in a pinch and I use that, and it enables me to save my Force Camo for other moments, because normally without this you'd have to use Force Camo to escape. Now my second utility point in this section here is Expunging Camouflage. Force Camouflage removes all cleansable effects when activated. Now I use this because it works in conjunction with Phantom, in that I get a movement speed boost to it, and also this will break roots as well, so now you have 2 root breakers to use, which gives you more ways to get out in a pinch and stay alive to do more DPS at the end of the day. So you can really never go wrong with Expunging Camouflage, you really can't. Although in ranked, I do replace this with Undying, since I like that extra 2 seconds on Undying Rage, and it's definitely useful. Now for my last 2 set of points here, I use Blood Ward as my first one, which is activating Saber Ward grants immunity to stun, sleep, lift, and incapacitating effects for 6 seconds, and getting attacked while Saber Ward is active heals you for 3% of your maximum health, and of course the effect cannot occur more than once every second. Now Saber Ward is one of your main defensives, and I'm going to get to defensives later on and I'll get in more detail with that, but this adds a really nice boost to that defensive, because as a Marauder you have very little self-heals, as a Fury Marauder anyway. Annihilation has heals, but as a Fury Marauder you don't really have heals, and this is your one main source of getting those heals. So definitely very useful. And it doesn't hurt to have immunity to stun, sleep, lift, or incapacitating effects too. So definitely a nice option to take. My second point in this pair is Ruthless Aggressor. Vicious Throw refunds 2 rage when used on a target affected by your Obfuscate, and can be used on any target affected by your Obfuscate regardless of remaining health. Additionally, activating Obfuscate grants you Ruthless Aggressor, increasing your force and tech resistance by 75% for 6 seconds. This point is definitely useful. It's one of the new points we got in patch 5.0 for Marauders, and it's been a blessing, honestly. It's a very, very good utility point. I would almost advise taking this in every situation, regs or ranked. They're both very good instances to use this in. With that 75% force and tech resistance, most classes do that type of damage, if not all of them, so this is a great way to shake people off. And it really is a nice offensive tool, but it can also be used as defensive. It's really a pseudo-offensive defensive move. You can use it any way you want, but offensively, for DPS dealing purposes, it's amazing, and I wouldn't advise taking anything else over this. It's a perfect utility point, and it shouldn't be going to waste. Definitely pick this. So that would do it for my utility portion of this guide, and I do believe that these will help you. I mean, they've helped me. Again, just like with gearing, with utilities, you can use anything you want, but I believe that these are going to give you the best results and yield the best DPS outputs. Alright, so when it comes to abilities for the Sith Marauder, and for the Fury Marauder in particular, you have quite a few options, and every single one counts in their own different way. They're all very important. But first we're going to go over the passives, or the key passives anyway. So your first key passive here is Battle Cry, which reduces the cooldown of Obliterate by 3 seconds and causes Force Charge and Obliterate to make your next Force Scream deal 5% more damage and generate 1 rage rather than consume it. Now pay attention more to the second half of this passive here, in that your Force Scream gets a 5% buff. Now any buff to damage is a good one, so always use Force Scream when it has this proc. It's very important. Your second important one is Dominate, in which Force Charge and Obliterate make your next Smash or Raging Burst used within 20 seconds, and Auto Crit, which again is very important. Auto Crit increases damage obviously, and you want to always use Raging Burst when this is buffed. Never use it when it's not buffed. Another key passive is Cascading Power, and it increases all damage dealt by 5% for 6 seconds after dealing damage with Smash or Raging Burst. This effect cannot occur more than once every 8 seconds. Now, Cascading Power is very important, since there is a window called the Cascading Power window in this spec, in which you want to get as many good hits in there as you can for this 5% boost. It's very important, and it should always be kept track of, and you should always be on the lookout for this so you can have proper damage output. Your next important passive is Destruction. Berserk and Force Crush grant Destruction, increasing the damage dealt by your next Smash or Raging Burst by 15%, and making your next Smash or Raging Burst consume no rage. Now this is very important, since for rage management purposes this is a key passive, arguably your key passive for rage management in the spec. So whenever you use Berserk and Force Crush, keep in mind that your next Smash or Raging Burst will not consume rage, and that leaves you open for filler moves and other moves you might have waiting on cooldown that you want to use later on. This definitely helps with rage management, and always be sure to use Smash and Raging Burst when procced by this, especially in conjunction with Dominate. Now your next important passive and final important passive is Furious Rage. Furious Strike grants Furious Rage, increasing the critical damage bonus for your next Smash or Raging Burst by 15%. Now it might not seem like a huge bonus, 15%, but it is very important since you have 15% boost along with your auto crit, which is 100%. So with that 100% crit chance and a 15% damage bonus, and on top of whatever mastery and power you have in there, you can get some really, really big hits on moves with this. And your Raging Burst will be buffed tremendously, on top of the other two buffs that were mentioned previously. So that would do it for the passive section. Now moving on to the active moves here, for offensive purposes anyway. So when it comes to your moves here, your number one move for opening is going to be Force Charge. You're going to leap in there with Force Charge. This is your way of getting in there and getting things started. Pretty self-explanatory. You leap at a target, it roots them for 2 seconds, and interrupts whatever they're doing at the moment. Again, most classes have some sort of entry move like this, and this is just the one from Marauder. Your key rage building move would be Battering Assault. Strikes the target multiple times, dealing damage and building 6 rage. Now 6 rage is half of your total, which is 12. You have 12 total rage as a Marauder in all 3 specs, and you want to make sure Battering Assault is used to keep your rage up. Not to mention, Battering Assault also deals a debuff to your opponent, increasing damage dealt by melee attacks, so that will definitely help later on down the line. So always use this first, before any of your melee moves in the rotation. Your main move for this spec is Raging Burst, which deals kinetic damage, and is a very powerful move. It's the move that your entire rotation will be centered around. You're going to be wanting to buff this move constantly, and your priority system will always be buffing this move, but more on that later. Your next move would be Ravage, which has been changed since years past, in which it once was a channel and now it's an instant ability. It's mainly a filler these days as opposed to a main DPS move as it was in the past, but now it's more of a filler DPS move, and it should be used as such. And for this particular spec, if you go back to the passives actually, you have Bloody Slashes here, which says damage dealt by Ravage stacks a bleeding effect on the target that builds up to 3 charges and deals X amount of internal damage over 9 seconds. Which is important since that is your only dot on this spec and it can be used tactically, but that will be explained more later on. Your next DPS move is Furious Strike, which is your second most important move and one of the moves that buffs your Raging Burst. You should always use this before Raging Burst, and only after if your rotation is different otherwise. But again, more on rotations later. Force Scream, as was established before, this gets a 5% damage boost from the passive Battle Cry, and it's very useful in that you get 1 rage back from it. It's not Berserk where it gives you a lot of rage back, but you might just need that 1 rage just to get 1 more move out if you don't have Berserk, and if it's still on cooldown, so it can be useful. Another DPS move you have here is Force Crush, which progressively slows the target from 50% to 5% movement speed over 3 seconds, and deals kinetic damage the same as Raging Burst does. Also another move you want to be using before Raging Burst. Now there's no set order to using Force Crush or Furious Strike before Raging Burst, but again that will be addressed in the rotation portion of the video. But it should always be used before Raging Burst, as it grants the proc that eliminates any rage needing to be used for Raging Burst, so that Raging Burst consumes no rage. Your final important DPS move is Obliterate, in which you jump to a target. It's basically your second leap on top of Force Charge, but with a slightly smaller range in between. That's a nice thing about Fury Spec. You technically have 2 leaps, because you have Force Charge and Obliterate. And it immobilizes the target for 1 second. Which can definitely help if you want to stop someone dead in their tracks and continue your DPS. And it's always useful to use, and it's one of your most used moves in your rotation. So always important to be using that on cooldown when you can. Now on to the secondary or less important DPS moves, as I call them. Although one is situational, that would be Smash. Now Smash is basically plays the same role as Raging Burst does, but for AoE as opposed to single target. It also requires the same buffs in that you have to use Force Crush and Fury Strike before you use Smash, and this should only be used on multiple targets. The nice thing about Fury is you can switch from single to AoE quite easily since the same buffs apply for both Smash and Raging Burst. So again, doesn't deal as much damage as Raging Burst, but still very useful for AoE, and it can crit decently on multiple targets. However, keep in mind the buff from Furious Strike giving you a 15% crit boost. That will only apply to the targeted target being hit. Everyone else around them will simply get regular auto crit damage without the extra boost. Your other move would be, the other secondary DPS move would be Dual Saber Throw. Another AoE move, and it should be used for AoE purposes only. However, it can be used as a filler in single target rotations, since affected enemies are slowed by 50% for 6 seconds, and that can be useful for keeping someone nice and slowed down if you don't want to use the next move, which is Crippling Slash. And Crippling Slash slows the movement of the target by 50% for 10 seconds and reduces its healing by 20% for 10 seconds. Now, this move should always be used on healers if you're going to chase the healers. I personally love chasing healers. It's my favorite thing to do, and I always make sure to use Crippling Slash. However, since it has the consuming factor of 3 rage, it's going to take up a decent chunk of your total rage, so be mindful and don't spam use this. Only use it on healers to apply the debuff, and for no one else. Your final secondary DPS move is Sweeping Slash. Slashes up to 8 enemies within 5 meters. Now, Sweeping Slash basically is a nice AoE move for your AoE rotation after you've used your buffed Smash. Or after you've used your Dual Saber Throw as well. Now, those 3 moves are really your main AoE moves: Sweeping Slash, Dual Saber Throw, and Smash. And Sweeping Slash is probably the second highest damage dealing of the 2. And again, very useful for AoE situations, but never used for single target. We now have Vicious Slash, which is the counterpart, the single target counterpart to the AoE Sweeping Slash. It deals slightly more damage, and I have found it to crit quite nicely at times with a higher crit build, even though it is a filler move. And I was actually very surprised when I initially played this spec and found how amazing Vicious Slash was as a filler, in that it sometimes does as much damage as your Raging Burst can do, believe it or not, once in a while. So again, always be mindful, very good move to use. Now, Vicious Slash actually lowers the active cooldown of Raging Burst by 1 second per use. So every time you use it, it's a 1 second time shave right off of Raging Burst, and you can get that out faster. So a nice way to use Vicious Slash is just spam it before Raging Burst, after you've already buffed it, of course, and then you just keep getting that Raging Burst off over and over again with that cooldown reduction from Vicious Slash. Again, very useful move. You then have Assault, which is basically useless, but only ever use it if you don't have any rage or if you're low on rage, but that shouldn't be happening since Fury Spec is quite manageable rage-wise for most people, I'd like to think, so it shouldn't be used ever. Now, I'm going to put Vicious Throw in my tertiary section of DPS moves since it's really not a primary or secondary one. It's just meant to be used when the target is about to die, basically. So I would simply replace Vicious Slash with Vicious Throw in your rotation towards the end of your opponent's life cycle or HP bar. So when they're getting low on health, you just use this, and it tends to crit quite nicely at times, and it's just good to use as opposed to Vicious Slash to finish somebody off, and it's really just your finish him move of sorts. Now, Vicious Throw does benefit from one of the utilities. It benefits from Ruthless Aggressor, in that you can use Vicious Throw on any target affected by it, and it will refund 2 rage. So you can actually include it in your opening rotation, if you want to, and I know I sometimes do. Or I just use it to supplement another move if I am running low on rage, which rarely happens, but in the case or the event that I am running low on rage, I would use Vicious Throw after popping Obfuscate. Again, very useful move, but not used often. So that should do it for all of the passives and active moves. that are offensive for the Fury Marauder, and they are all very important in rotation. They're all almost equally important, minus the secondary moves, but again, more on that in the rotation section of the video. Alright, so when it comes to your rotation as a Fury Marauder, as was mentioned previously, it's very important to be buffing your Raging Burst, as there really is no real rotation, as most people will tell you. This is just a priority system for this particular spec in which you have to buff Raging Burst constantly using Furious Strike and Force Crush, respectively. Now, for an opener, there's definitely a bit of a set order, but once you get past the opener, it's really just priority system of spamming buffed Raging Bursts over and over again. That's really the bulk of what your rotation will be. Now, for your opener, it would be quite simple, really. You'd pop your Frenzy here, which will activate your Berserk instantly, give you free 30 stacks of Fury here. You would then pop your Berserk, like so. Then you would leap in. Use your Force Crush, then Furious Strike, add a filler like Ravage in between, and the Ravage is a filler in between, which I like to use, or you can use that after. Then your buffed Force Scream, then your Obliterate, and then from there it's really just whatever you want to do. It's honestly up to you. As long as you follow that priority system, you should be fine and have everything down pat. Okay, defensive cooldowns for the Fury Marauder. Now, you mainly have 3 defensive cooldowns that you're going to rely upon the most, but of course with utilities and, you know, tactics, things like that, you have other defensives, pseudo-defensive, etc. you can use. But your main 3 are narrowed down to Cloak of Pain, Saber Ward, and Undying Rage. Now, Cloak of Pain reduces all damage taken by 20% and deals energy damage to attackers whenever they attack you. This effect cannot occur more than once every second and lasts 10 seconds, which is actually buffed up to 14 if you take the proper utility. Cloak of Pain refreshes to its full duration when attacked, but the effect can't last more than 30 seconds in total. So that's quite a decent amount of time to have a raw 20% damage reduction flat. Now, you can also, and I like to use this tactic a lot, you can pop Cloak of Pain in conjunction with a Warzone Adrenal, which will increase damage reduction by 15%. So add that to 20, you have a total of 35% damage reduction. With my current default damage reduction here, I have about 31%. So adding 35 there, that would be about 66% damage reduction, which is quite good overall. Now, I like to pop Cloak of Pain usually at the beginning of a fight just to mitigate as much as possible, but occasionally I'll wait things out and wait until I get, 2v1'd, or if I start getting focused, then I'll pop it quickly. But it's usually your first line of defense as a Marauder, a Fury Marauder specifically. You want to use this pretty much on cooldown when you get the chance. When it comes to Saber Ward, you increase melee and range defense by 50% and absorb 25% of damage taken from force and tech attacks, and this lasts 12 seconds. Now, Saber Ward is a very, very important defensive, and it can't be used that often considering that it has a 3-minute cooldown, which is quite a long time compared to other classes and their cooldowns, so you want to definitely use this wisely. Now, since you have Cloak of Pain on in the beginning of a fight, I would not advise throwing Saber Ward in there with it, since that would be a waste, in my opinion, of a very good defensive. You want to wait for Cloak of Pain to be completely gone, and if you're still being focused, you can then pop Saber Ward if you're somewhere below about, you know, 70, 80% health. That's really a good time to pop it. But I would never recommend popping this at full health. Like, you know, for certain examples, let's say, you're fighting a class that's very, how do I say, melee oriented, like, I want to say, another Marauder, like an Annihilation or a Fury Marauder. Or even, yeah, pretty much any Marauder you fight Juggernauts, you know, they're pretty melee based. You fight, Assassins, you know, those classes will lose quite a bit of DPS when you deflect a lot of their moves as a result of your 50% range defense increase. So that's definitely, you know, a couple good classes to use this against. But Saber Ward really should only be used when you're in the heat of things, if you have 2 to 3 people on you, or you're getting 2v1'd and you want to just increase your odds of survival, or winning that 2v1. It's definitely a good time to use it. Another good time to use this is when an Arsenal Merc attacks you, when an Arsenal Mercenary decides to go unloading on you. Saber Ward will block out most of their Blazing Bolts, which is a very annoying move for them to use since it does slow you a bit. And this will definitely block a couple of those hits and negate any chances of them getting any of their buffs out of that move. That's a good time to use it. If a Deception Assassin's coming at you and they want to use their auto crit and maul, this will just deflect that right off the bat, and you can get a much better chance of survival with these odds against a Deception Assassin. I know even a Hatred Assassin, if you fight them, you know, they want to use their melee version of Force Leech, whatever the name of the move is, and this would negate that, thus negating their chances of getting any help from that move. So those are just 2 examples of what you can use it for. Another case, actually, you can use this for if you have a Rage or a Vengeance Juggernaut coming at you. This is a very good thing to use, since for Vengeance you'll negate their auto crit Impale, which is a pretty devastating move at times. You want to negate that. For Rage Juggernaut, they'll be using their own Furious Strike against you, so you can definitely avoid that auto crit, and that would be a very momentous thing to avoid, and it would definitely hinder their DPS quite a bit. But again, those are just a few examples of how you can use Saber Ward. But again, I would never use it anywhere above about like 60, 70, 80% health, you know? You don't want to use it when you're too close to max health, because it's a waste of a good defensive, and you should really only use it when you're in the thick of things. The only time you shouldn't use it in deep battle, of course, is if you're having a 1v2 or 2v1, and it's not really going your way. You definitely want to pop this. But there's nothing more I can say about that, really. Just pop it in sticky situations, primarily in the thick of things. Now for Undying Rage, it reduces the damage you take by 99% for 4 seconds. Again, you're not invincible with this move. You still take 1% of the total damage, so with enough people on you, you can still potentially die. It's possible. It's rare, but it's still possible. You get 4 seconds of that. Now with the right utility, you can get 6 seconds out of it. I personally don't take that utility unless it's for ranked, but this move in ranked is very useful. In regs and ranked, however, this move really just delays the inevitable if you use it against multiple people, you know, attacking you at once, because you will die 4 seconds later, so this is really just a way to get some last second DPS out, or maybe just to finish somebody off if you're both at equally low health. But other than that, this move really just delays the inevitable for the most part, but should only be used under very specific and rare circumstances. Your 4th defensive, and not one of the main 3, but again very important, especially with 2 utilities you can take. You boost the movement speed from 50 to 80%, and it can purge roots, as well as not requiring 30 stacks of Fury with the other utility. You get a 10% melee and range defense, which is always nice. It's not that much, but again, always nice to have. More defense is great, keeps you alive longer, keeps you doing DPS longer. That's what you want at the end of the day. But the real key benefit to this is to your group, because in PvP, you know, you want to get to an objective, you want to cap something, you want to stop someone else from capping your objective. This is a great way to get that nice boost to get there and shut down that situation, or start up one if you want to do that. Again, very good for the group, and very good for you singularly, since you get that nice root break, which helps. Especially if you don't have Obliterate available and you can't, break a root with that, Predation is a nice backup. I use this on cooldown just to keep my movement speed at max speed, so I can keep on going. Now, your next defensive, which is Obfuscate, obscures the target's vision, reducing its melee and range accuracy by 90% for 6 seconds. And this ability does not respect the GCD or global cooldown, so just keep that in mind when using it. Now, with the proper utility Ruthless Aggressor, you'll get that 75% Tech and Force resist chance, which is very useful, since again, like I mentioned previously, most classes have, most if not all classes have Tech and Force damage, and this will just negate most of it outright, and it's very useful, especially for fighting Mercs. Who else? Mercs, Sorcerers, other Marauders especially. Obfuscate is very useful on. Especially Marauders like other Fury Marauders, because you can just negate their buffed Raging Burst and destroy everything their rotation was working for. So it's very useful there. The melee and range accuracy reduction on your opponents is very good, again for Mercenaries. Snipers very useful. Lethality Operatives, their main DPS comes from a ranged attack, so that will definitely hinder their DPS if they can't hit that move as often, especially since it's their auto crit. Melee accuracy is reduced for Assassins, other Marauders again, Juggernauts, etc. So this move basically can be used on any other class in the game with decent effect, at least. So I always use this on cooldown in any fight, because it just helps. Or I sometimes will save it in ranked. I'll save it and use it for a particularly sticky situation. I might combine it with a Warzone Adrenal, or I might combine it with Cloak of Pain, or even Saber Ward sometimes, if I'm really in a pinch. Or I might pop it right after Undying Rage to delay that inevitability of my death, but that's just a couple ways you can use it. You can also use it offensively, of course, if you want to charge into a group and just negate most of their damage, but it's really a defensive move. A pseudo-defensive, arguably, but it's mainly defensive. That's what I would use it for, defensive purposes. Your other line of defenses are Intimidating Roar and Force Camouflage, along with Mad Dash. Now, going in order here, Intimidating Roar paralyzes up to 8 enemies in fear, preventing all action for up to 6 seconds, and damage will end the effect prematurely. Keep in mind this is a soft stun. Do not hit anyone after using this. Some of the biggest mistakes I've seen Marauders do is they pop Intimidating Roar, they have a chance to solo a target and cap an objective possibly, and they'll just hit Smash, or use Dual Saber Throw, or hit all of the other targets and just completely waste the effect. Always use this to gain the upper hand, not to gain it and then suddenly lose it, like most people do. It can also be used in 1v1s if you want to get out of one. If you're losing one, very useful. You pop that, and then you pop your Force Camouflage. Now, speaking of Force Camouflage, it obscures yourself with the Force, becoming difficult to detect, reducing threat towards enemies. That's really more PvE. Reducing all damage taken by 50%, granting immunity to controlling effects, and increasing movement speed by 30%. And it lasts for 6 seconds. Dealing direct damage will end the effect prematurely. So another thing I'll see people do when they play Marauders, they'll use Force Camo, they'll try to get out of a sticky situation, and then they'll change their mind and say, oh, I'm going to go attack that person right now and just completely waste my getaway, and then they end up dying after, and they're scratching their heads wondering what they did wrong. Meanwhile, they screwed themselves, so you don't want to use this and then immediately attack someone after. Especially when you're trying to escape, because again, that's the only way I use this, is as an escape. I never use this move offensively. And especially with that damage reduction, if someone hits you with an AoE, they might not unstealth you, but they'll also not do as much damage, which helps, especially if you're at low health, and you do get hit by a stray AoE here and there, you won't die of it, most of the time. Although I have definitely been killed by a few AoEs while in Force Camo, and it is a bit frustrating, so learn from my mistakes, don't stay in the fight when you use Force Camo. Get out as soon as you can, as fast as you can. And speaking of speed, Mad Dash here. You madly dash forward 20 meters, dealing insert damage here, damage to enemies in your path, and increase your defense chance by 100%. Cannot be used while immobilized or hindered. Now there is a utility that can make it be used while immobilized, but I don't see it as being worth it personally. Now, a big mistake people will do, and it could be a mistake, it could be a really nice tool, I don't know how you want to see it, but I see it as, the best of both worlds here. You can use this as an escape, of course, because with that 100% defense chance, you can dodge some big hits. Let's say a sniper is charging up their ambush and it's got auto crit on it. You want to definitely avoid that. You mad dash out of there and that move is negated 100%. And they wasted their auto crit. You can also use this if someone's going to hit you with a tech attack as well, not just a ranged ambush. If Merc's going to hit you with their with a tracer missile or something like that, you can just use this to get out of the way. If they're going to hit you with a buffed rail shot, you can mad dash out of there. If an assassin's going to hit you with a fully buffed discharge, you can mad dash out of it. You can basically use this for anything, in any situation. But it should only be used as a defensive. However, you can use this as a gap closer to get close to people, and you can use it just to get around the map better. But I do think that predation is a much better substitute for mobility than mad dash is. But again, up to you. You can use whichever one you want. Just my recommendation. Now, another move here, which I do argue that this can be used defensively because you can use it as a sort of last stand move here. That's Bloodthirst. Requires and converts 30 stacks of fury to issue Bloodthirst. Within 40 meters, increases all damage and healing done by 10%. Now, if a healer's on their last limb, you can pop this and save them. So that is a way you can use this defensively. You can use this to gain the upper hand in a 1v1 last second if you want to, but it really should only be used for the group. This can help the group if you're on a Void Star, let's say, and a lot of you are about to die while you're playing the defensive role, and you don't want the enemies to cross the bridge. This can be used as a last stand. That can help you. I know I've had matches where I popped this, or someone else, another Marauder, popped this, and it helped us win by just a smidge, and it was very useful. So that's why I argue for this move as more of a defensive than offensive, mainly because I use it defensively. Now, your final defensive... I'm sorry, your second to last defensive. There's still another after this. Disruption. You disrupt its target's current action and prevent the ability they're using from being used for the next 4 seconds. Now, disrupt, this is your interrupt, really. All classes have an interrupt of some sort. Most people never use them, which I find baffling. You should be using them all the time, especially on classes and specs that cast a lot, like snipers and sorcerers. I know Darkness Assassin, their depredating bolts can sometimes be annoying. You can use it to disrupt that too. Even for tanks it works, that's an example. But you should always be using this to disrupt cast, especially snipers, since they're very annoying to fight. And as a Marauder, you want to definitely cut off all their sources of damage to better defeat them at the end of the day. It's always good to use, and should always be used. Your final defensive here is Unleash. It's basically your purging move. Every class has a purge move of sorts. This is just the one from Marauder here. Purge is all incapacitating and movement impairing effects. Now this, just like the other defensives, should be used wisely. You shouldn't just pop this as soon as you get stunned or as soon as you get knocked around, because you really should save this for a situation when you're about to die and you have no other cooldowns left. This is one of the last cooldowns I usually use, but you can also use this if you've been double stunned and you want to break that second stun. I definitely do that sometimes. But always use this wisely and don't waste your stun breaker, especially in rank. Do not waste your stun breaker. So that would do it for the defensives for Fury Marauder, and for Marauders in general, actually. So you should always be mindful of when and how you're using these defensives. Again, there will be more on tactics later, how you can use these in basic tactical situations. But this is just the general idea of how you want to use them and in what ways you can use them. Alright, so for the final main section of the video here, we're going to discuss fighting other classes. Now, when it comes to fighting other classes, each class is different and fighting each one isn't any different. You need to be able to detect all their defensives and offensives and know how to counter them, and know how to take them on. Now, I'm going to start with other Marauders, because of course, if you don't know how to fight your own class, which is essentially fighting yourself, then how do you know how to fight anybody else, right? So when it comes to fighting other Marauders, what you're going to need to look out for, the main 3 things against them would be Saber Ward, Obfuscate, and Undying Rage. Now, the most annoying thing you can have as a Marauder is when you're trying to get melee DPS out there, like for Fury, you're trying to use your Furious Strike, your Vicious Slash, your Obliterate, or your Ravage, right? And they'll pop a Saber Ward, and they have a 50% increase in deflection chance. And that can potentially negate an auto-crit Furious Strike, which is a big no-no. You want to get that hit off, you want to get it right. So ways to counter this and to get yourself out of the situation of them out DPSing you, since you won't be able to do as much against their Saber Ward, is you can always use Force Choke and just stun them outright, and just shave off 4 of their 12 seconds of Saber Ward, and then tough the other 8 seconds out, and just go through it. And simply hold your Furious Strike, Ravage, and Vicious Slash, as well as Obliterate for later on when that defensive dies down. Another tactic you can use is use your Force Choke and then use Intimidating Roar, and that adds to a total of 10 seconds, thus negating 10 of the 12 seconds of Saber Ward that they have, assuming that they don't use Stun Break, of course. But even if they do use Stun Break, you've now gained an advantage in that you've used one of the stuns and you still have another left that they can't break. So even if you use Intimidating Roar, let's say they break that, you still have another 4 seconds you can get free from having to deal with their Saber Ward. Or vice versa, you can choke them for 4 seconds and they try to break that, they break that midway, and then you still have another 6 seconds that they can't break out of through Intimidating Roar. So either way, you can negate roughly half of all their Saber Ward uptime with those 2 moves combined. Or you can just force Camo out of there and just avoid the fight altogether. Especially if you know it's someone in particular who you can't beat in a 1v1, or if you're just not very good at 1v1s in general. You can just use Force Camo and bail and just get out of there. You can also use Mad Dash as well to get out if you want to escape, but keep in mind they might use the same move to come after you. So really the best 2 things to do in this order are probably use your 2 stuns here and use Force Camo, or use Force Camo to get out of there. When it comes to dealing with another Marauder's Obfuscate, because as previously mentioned, it's probably the best thing to use against other Marauders, it's the worst thing to fight against in regards to fighting other Marauders. So when it comes to Obfuscate, really, again, the same applies. You can use Intimidating Roar and Force Choke in conjunction. It's possible. However, keep in mind they do have their 75% Tech and Force resist chance, so that might not be as viable of an option. One thing I usually do is I use Mad Dash to escape and let them chase me around for a bit while their Obfuscate runs dry and dies down. That's one way of doing things. Another way, of course, is bailing out using Force Camo, right? But my most, and I believe my most potent way of dealing with this, and best way of dealing with this, is to simply forego all of your Force-based attacks, like Force Crush, Force Scream, and Raging Burst, and take the opportunity to start building up for your Raging Burst when their Obfuscate dies down. So you can use your Ravage as a filler, for example. Yes, they might negate your dots, but that damage is fairly negligible compared to the actual damage of Ravage itself, so they won't be able to resist Ravage. You can also use Obliterate, because that generally will hit them. You can use your Furious Strike, you can use Dual Saber Throw. I tend to use Vicious Slash, because I can use that to build up for my Raging Burst. So even in what could seem like a time of crisis, you can just simply stay cool and build up your Raging Burst, again for when Obfuscate dies down, and continue and resume your DPS output, thus effectively negating their Obfuscate entirely. So when in doubt, with Obfuscate being used against you, just go with your melee DPS, and wait that out, and just go back to using your force attacks afterwards. A great way to counter that. Now, when it comes to countering their Undying Rage, again, this is a pattern here. You can use your Force Choke and Intimidating Roar, and/or both, and/or one or the other, to negate their 4 seconds, or 6 seconds if they took the utility, of time that it takes for that move to run dry. And you can just, sit that out. Or again, you can use Force Camo, bail out of there. You can use Mad Dash, let them chase you again. Same tactic goes for that. You can also use Assault in the meantime if you don't have those defensives, or you simply want to stick around. You can use things like Battering Assault or Assault that do no damage either way, and simply build Rage in the meantime. So again, what could be a time of crisis, you can use to build up your own offense. You can get more Rage out of that, despite there being no damage done. And then you can simply resume your regular DPS output when Undying Rage wears off. Other than those 3 things, there really isn't anything else major to encounter with other Marauders and fighting them. It's really those 3 that me personally, that has given me personally an issue with fighting them. But again, know your enemy. If you are a Marauder, you should know how to fight another Marauder, and these are the 3 things you should look out for when fighting another Marauder. In regards to fighting Jugs, it's almost a similar story to Marauders, but with a few minor differences. Now, depending upon what you're fighting, you could be fighting any of the 3 specs. You could fight Vengeance, Rage, or even an Immortal Juggernaut. Now, when it comes to Immortal Juggernauts, I'm just going to say this right out of the blue here. You shouldn't be fighting a tank, especially a skank tank, if they're geared that way. You should just avoid that fight altogether. But since you do have a couple passives that give you some armor penetration boost, you can still give it a try, but it really is a waste of time in terms of how you could spend it. You could be off doing an objective somewhere. So what I recommend with them is just, stun them, force camo, and get out of there before anything happens. Because they're just either too annoying to fight or just not worth it to fight at that particular moment in time. When it comes to fighting Vengeance or Rage, the only real defensive that you can truly counter for Jugs is how do I say, enraged defense. That's really the only one you can truly fully counter. Now, Saber Ward is the same idea. You should just stun them and or run away. So that's a repeat of what you should do for Marauder with Jugs. When it comes to enraged defense, they get 12 charges of heals every time you hit them. So what should you do? Don't hit them. Use a stun. The same way like with any other defensive they use, like Saber Ward, you stun them, you wait out the time. You give chase. You let them run after you, and you just wait out their enraged defense, and go back to attacking again. You just want to make sure that you avoid them damaging you in the meantime. When it comes to Assassins, it's a little bit more difficult. I think they're one of the more difficult classes to fight against, but not the most difficult to fight against. Now, when it comes to Assassins, when it comes to fighting Assassin tanks, the same goes as for Immortal. Avoid them at all costs if you can, but you could try to fight them. It's possible you could defeat them if they're not a very good assassin, or if they simply are under-geared. You can try to fight them, but generally speaking, you want to avoid them the same way as you would Immortal Juggernauts. But when it comes to fighting Deception or Hatred, Deception will be your biggest enemy of the 2. Now, Hatred has decent damage against Marauders, but they're mainly dots, and you can just negate most of their dot damage with your raw damage reduction through Warzone Adrenals or Cloak of Pain, or just absorb everything through Saber Ward. So they're not too much of a problem, but for both those specs in particular, both those specs, Deception in particular is going to be annoying to fight, but their main 3 things they can use against you are Force Shroud, Deflection, and Overload. Now, Force Shroud gives them, by default, 3 seconds of Tech and Force immunity, so you want to make sure to not hit them with any of your Force moves while they have that up. With the proper utility, they get that up to about 5 seconds, so you want to, for those 3 to 5 seconds of them having it up, you want to not hit them with anything involving Force damage. And one thing you can do, just like when a Marauder pops their Obfuscate on you, with Assassins who pop Force Shroud, you can just hit them with melee moves in the meantime and build up your Raging Burst for the time when their Force Shroud runs dry. So again, like with most other defensives, you just wait it out. When it comes to them using Deflection, Deflection is basically like Saber Ward, but without the Tech and Force absorption. They get that nice Deflection boost. With utility, they can get, with their utility, I forgot the name, but it's basically like Blood Ward, where you get that 6 seconds of immunity to sleep, lift, incapacitating effects, etc., etc. That move is going to give you some trouble in regards to your melee moves, and if they take the utility that reflects moves back at you, you definitely don't want to get reflected, you definitely don't want to get your Raging Burst fully buffed and procced reflected back at you. So with that move, like many others, you just stun and run, or you stealth out of there. Or what I like to do is I figure if I'm going to wait it out, if I have nothing left, I'm going to hit them with an Obfuscate, and make sure that they can't hit me at the same time I can't hit them. So it keeps things nice and even. That's what I do. When it comes to Overload, most assassins tend to take the utility that roots you afterwards. Now, as has been established before, you can use Obliterate to negate that root entirely, if you can get within range and hit them with that. Now that's the main way to really get out of that, but again, your Force Camo with the right utility, Expunging Camouflage, you can break free of that root and get out of there and get back to the fight. Now when it comes to Sorcerer, it's basically the same thing for Overload. You want to use those same tactics previously mentioned, since they have the same move and the same utility as well. Now with sorcerers, obviously, you have to deal with double bubbling. Now they're going to have their... I forgot the name, I apologize. I just call it Invincibubble, because that's basically what it is. And they're going to have some nice absorption afterwards once they get out of that, and they might have potentially healed to full during that time if they took the utility. So what you want to do is you want to spam Vicious Slash as much as you can, as opposed to wasting your main rotation moves on them during that time. So you want to negate both their bubbles, their Invincibubble and their Static Barrier. Now, they might pop their Static Barrier in the middle of a fight just to negate your burst, which, to that, again, I would say use fillers like Vicious Slash and Dual Saber Throw, and even Battering Assault if you have to, or Ravage, just to get rid of that Absorbed Shield, to get rid of that Static Barrier and give you more of an opening to use your primary moves, Raging Burst, Furious Strike, and Force Crush. That's a good way to get around that. Other than those things, that's really all you need to do when it comes to encountering sorcerers. Now, when it comes to snipers, I believe they are your arguably number one, toughest opponent to fight. Normally, snipers eat marauders for breakfast. You know, it's what they do. They're very, very good in the meta right now. I know that. I play an engineering sniper myself, but that's besides the point. When it comes to fighting snipers, you gotta deal with Shield Probe. That's their first line of defense. Most, if not all, snipers will pop that as soon as you start doing damage to them. Just like with Sorks, you want to pretty much use Vicious Slash to negate, or at least not to negate, but to wait out their the Shield Probe and just let them absorb the Vicious Slash. Let them think they've negated a lot of the damage, and then hit them with a fully proc Raging Burst afterwards, and it just shakes them. Shakes them to their knees. Then after that, you want to use another counter, very similar one when they use Evasion. You want to not use your melee because they have a 200% dodge chance that will pretty much negate your melee entirely. So in that case, you want to use force-based attacks. Now, I believe Evasion does partially negate some force attacks, at least with damage, but you should still use those in the meantime. Better than not doing any damage at all and missing on a Furious Strike, especially when it's auto-crit procced. Another thing to look out for is when snipers roll, now specifically engineering, also, one of the very good specs in the meta, if they're going to root you as a result of that, which they most certainly will, since roll does that, a way to negate that is use Force Camo. Or if they rolled into an object close by and you're still within range, use your Obliterate, break the root. It's the same idea with Overload on Assassins and Sorks. You want to do the same thing here. And for their final defensive, which I believe is important to counter, is Leg Shot. You do the same thing. Obliterate if they're within range. If not, Force Camo and get out of there. Or if you have the utility, use Mad Dash and break the roots. That would do it for snipers. Now, when it comes to operatives, it's similar to snipers in that, yes, Shield Probe, you want to wait out that absorption factor. Evasion, you want to pop those, you want to use those force attacks as opposed to melee attacks. But the separate thing with them is that their roles, I believe, have slightly different defensives. I think they have a chance to dodge attacks while rolling as well. Along with snipers, actually, they do too. So you want to not use your auto-crit moves if you notice that they're about to roll, but sometimes it's just so unpredictable because operatives will be operatives and snipers will be snipers. But you want to try to avoid hitting them during a roll, because that would be devastating to your damage output and could potentially lose you a 1v1. Also, when operatives go into stealth and you feel like they're going to attack you, you need to hit Smash or Sweeping Slash as quickly as possible to try to rip them out of stealth before they can get a stealth-based attack off on you and stun you or root you or snare you in any way. That will give you the upper hand as opposed to letting them start the fight. You get to start the fight for once, which is always nice against stealth, to catch them off guard like that. Very good thing to do and makes your life easier. In regards to fighting power techs, it's obviously much different since they don't have stealth rolls, but power techs mainly to counter their hydraulic overrides, which gives them a 35% or possibly 75% movement speed boost if they took the utility, which most certainly do. You want to stun them and wait out that hydraulic overrides, because if they get that out on you, they'll use the same tactic mentioned earlier against you. They'll use their medium range tech attacks and blow you to bits. They'll hit you with magnetic blasts, they'll hit you with their rail shots, with their energy bursts, and you won't be within melee range. And if they pop a sonic missile after that, forget that. You're gonna have a couple of your moves resisted, since they have a resist chance on that. So you really want to get rid of their hydraulic overrides. It gets rid of their mobility, and it keeps them right where you want them. When it comes to Kolto Probe, it has been nerfed recently. It only heals up to 35% now, as opposed to, I think, 40 the number was before this recent patch. And when it comes to Kolto Probe, like a lot of other moves, you want to wait it out, because if you keep hitting them with burst, I know power techs can get taken out quite easily, and they can get overwhelmed by multiple people with Kolto, but for single 1v1 purposes, you really don't want to burst into it, because they might just negate everything at the end. Now, I have on certain occasions been able to use Force Crush, then Force Strike, and time that with a Raging Burst so that the Force Crush and the Raging Burst hit at the same time, and that has finished them in some cases if the moves hit high enough or ended up critting high enough. I know that has worked in some cases. I often use that against their Kolto to shut it down right away and make them waste it. Another thing that you need to guard against for them is Grapple. Now, I do believe Grapple is a tech-based move, so if I am correct, you want to hit them with an Obfuscate if you're going to run away and you assume that they'll grapple or pull you back in. You would be able to resist it in that case, and that's a great way to use Obfuscate against them. Another move you want to use that against is Carbonize. If they're going to hit you with a Carbonize, like let's say you take a hit on their main stun. I apologize, I forgot the name for it. But if they use their initial stun on you, and then they use Carbonize, you can let them take the first stun and let them hit you with it. And then you can use Obfuscate after, pop that after, and let them hit you with a Carbonize, and that doesn't do anything. And you can stun them in the meantime, since that move's activation time can be a bit long sometimes. And you can catch them off guard that way. When it comes to Mercenaries, the same goes for Hydraulic Overrides. Now, they don't have that 75% speed boost, but again, they're even more range than PTs, Power Techs, so you don't want them getting that range on you. You want them right where you want them. So you want to hit them with those stuns, Intimidating Roar, and Force Choke. That's really the way you're going to get things done. Same goes like for Power Tech. When it comes to Kolto, it's much different for Mercenaries. They, with the proper utility, can get up to 70% heals, which I think is ridiculous. Most people in the community will agree. But nonetheless, it is 70%, whether we like it or not. And that is a lot of health, and you definitely can't use the tactic of Force Crushing, Fury Striking, and then Rage Bursting on them after that. That won't work. That won't get them down all the way. So when it comes to countering that particular move, you want to just stun them, run away, stealth out, do what you can, wait it out. It will still heal them to 70%, unfortunately, if you have gotten them below that previously or prior to them using it. So that is unfortunate, but make sure you get out of there. Their final defensive, which is Responsive Safeguards, another move, whether we like it or not, it's here to stay, but I think it's ridiculous. Mercs end up absorbing pretty much all your damage, and they reflect half of it back at you. And if they take the utility, it will heal them pretty much to full right after. And if it doesn't, they can just pop med pack right after, and it's ridiculously overpowered, in my opinion. And most people's opinions, too, they'll tell you the same. When it comes to that, again, stun and run, or stealth out of there. And after they're done with that defensive, you can go back in and kill them. I find usually they use that when they're on their last limb. You wait that out a little bit, or you simply don't attack them and take their hits, whatever's coming at you. I sometimes pop Undying Rage while they use that, just to even the score a little bit, and then I wait that out and finish them off after with a nice bursty rotation again. And that usually kills them, right then and there. So that should do it for fighting all other classes in the game, and hopefully that has helped you in being able to combat them better. Okay, so to conclude this guide, I would just like to thank pretty much everyone on Delphi who's ever written a guide, since I took a couple bits and pieces from some of those guides in terms of how to categorize this guide here. And I really did like the way they did things. I would give shoutouts to specific names, but I don't remember them off the top of my head, and I'd rather not care to look, but if they are watching, just know that I am thankful to you for providing this information. Just another thing I wanted to say before I finish this here. It was definitely interesting making a guide for the first time. I've never done it before, and I hope that this will help some of you, whether you be experienced or inexperienced. But, yeah, I just hope that this helped you and that it gave you a decent insight on how to play Fury Marauder, even if it wasn't perfect. And I know this guide definitely wasn't perfect. If I didn't mention anything in the comments below, you can, of course, question me anything you want to question me about. Just ask questions there, and I'll see if I can get back to you as soon as I can ASAP. And, yeah, again, for the final time, I did hope this helped you and that you're able to better yourself as a Fury Marauder. So, yeah, kudos to you all for choosing to play this class if you've decided to, and I wish you all the best of luck in your future endeavors and war zones.